Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover. And this evening, I'm joined with Delegate Marcus Simon, who represents the 53rd District. Marcus, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Lindsey. It's great to be here.
Well, tell us about the 53rd District. What areas do you represent?
Sure. So most people around here don't know district numbers, but
Right.
we know the neighborhoods, right? So the 53rd District really sort of started in Falls Church. We've got the city of Falls Church, and then it comes out Route 29 into Merrifield and the Mosaic District. And actually where we are right now is in the 53rd District. So Pivot Hills to the north, Route 50 in the hospital, Nova Hospital to the south, Falls Church City out to Merrifield. Those are sort of the hubs of the district.
That's great. Now, you grew up in this area. I know, graduating from McLean High School.
Yeah.
What originally prompted you to go into public service?
Well, it's funny, a couple things actually. So growing up here in the DC area, my dad came to Washington in the late 1960s, early 70s, this sort of national call to service, and to answer Kennedy's call to ask what you can do for your country. And so he came and worked for a Ralph Nader organization as a consumer advocate in the 1970s. And then, so I grew up in sort of that household, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was sick from school, I'd get dragged into my dad's office and listen to guys that are trying to fight the deregulation of public television and children's television. And so I grew up with sort of that sense of that. And then I graduated from college in 1992, and short answer is I needed a job. And my delegate at the time, Jim Scott, who represented the area of McLean where I lived, was looking for legislative aid. So it seemed like a natural fit. It was I had sort of a passion for the service and the politics and good government. He needed an employee and I needed a job. So that's sort of how it got started. Yeah. Went down to Richmond with him, and I really thought this would be something to do for a while, but my focus, like a lot of us in DC, is national. But my first session in Richmond, I really fell in love with the process down there, where you could actually watch a piece of legislation go from an idea, some constituent calling up saying, here's the problem I'd like to see solved. You watch the bills get drafted, and in one 60-day session, you see it introduced on the floor, go to committee, go to the House floor, move over to the Senate, go to committee, go to the Senate floor, and get signed by the governor, all within a relatively manageable period of time. So watching how that happened and played out was just, I thought it was the best thing in the world. So I figured someday I'd be back, hopefully on the other side of the desk, pressing the green button every now and then. So.
Well, it's incredible, like you said, to see an idea move through the process and actually affect people's lives in a positive way. I mean, that's a really incredible thing to be able to shepherd through.
Yeah, no, and it's one of the things I really like about politics at the state and local level is it's tangible and it's immediate, right? And you get to see the results of your work in all kinds of ways. We deal with the issues that affect. I see this all the time. It affects you every time you back out of your driveway, right? Like how long it's going to take you to get out of your driveway if you live on a busy street, whether you can do it or not. How long it's going to take you to get to work. How many kids, if you drop your kids off at school, how long is that carpool line? How many kids do they have to share that little room and that teacher with, right? All those things are things that are a function a lot of what happens at the state and local level.
That's great. Well, you have a legacy of service, and you talked a little bit about your father, but also you served in the military as well, and I know you've been very active in our local community. How does that legacy of service really informed how you govern in Richmond?
Well, sure. Well, it's one of the interesting things. When I got out of law school, I knew I wasn't going to work for a big firm. Right? I wasn't going to change teams. I was probably going to go with either government service or some sort of legal services job. But the Army sort of called to me, and again, something my dad had done. So, and they promised me something that I really liked, which was responsibility right out of the gate. I didn't have to work for under a layer of junior partners and partners. I can start doing my own cases right away. And so again, I've always sort of been a really hands-on kind of a person. And so being able to solve those problems has been great. And it does affect. So let me sort of back up for a second. So I got out of the Army, and I needed to make a living.
Sure.
And I became a real estate attorney. And I'd always worked either working for Jim Scott or Kate Hanley at Fairfax County, or even as the Army. It was never about the money. We always could have sold ourselves. We could make more money elsewhere, but we were doing this because it was about the cause.
Right.
As a real estate attorney, it's really about the money. But it's a great lifestyle to allow me to the freedom to really pursue my passion. outside of regular business hours. And so actually running for the House of Delegates was really the perfect fit for that, because in my business, our busy season's over the summer and our winter is really sort of quiet, which is perfect for our legislative session. And so it's been a good fit, and it helps me continue that, that idea. I've always, grown up believing that you're supposed to leave the world, that you come into a better place than you found it.
Right.
My dad used to make the analogy when we stay at a beach house. You always, like, well, this is cleaner than when we got here. And he's like, that's the point, right? You keep cleaning until it's a little bit better than you left it. We're supposed to do the same thing with our communities, our homes, our neighborhoods, our country. And so that's what I'm trying to do in the legislature as well. It's like, hey, just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean we can't find a better way to do it. And hopefully when I leave the General Assembly, whether it's on my own terms or because somebody voted me out, Virginia is going to be a better place because of some of the things I was able to accomplish while I was there.
Well, that's great. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. This is going to be your 4th term. What are you most proud of? I mean, you've been able to work on some incredible pieces of legislation in 4 terms, and I know we're going to later talk about what's to come, which I know is going to be exciting, but what are you most proud of that you've been able to get done?
So, interestingly, in the minority, it's been hard to pass a lot of legislation, but one of the things that just being a member of the House of Delegates allowed me to do was a few years ago, we had a shooting in Fairfax County, and Sharon Bulova created a ad hoc police practices task force. And I read about it in the paper, and being a delegate, I was able to call Sharon and say, hey, I'd love to help with this. What can I do? Next thing I knew, I got a letter from her Chief of Staff Clayton, says, you're on the commission. Our first meeting is Tuesday at 7:30, don't be late, right?
Yes.
So, and she actually had me chair a subcommittee on dealing with crisis intervention team training, CIT, and mental health issues, and how the police could better interface with people in mental health crises. And out of that subcommittee grew this project that they have in Fairfax now called Diversion First, where we sort of said to all of our police agencies, our CSBs and everybody, let's work together collaboratively to sort of decriminalize mental illness in Virginia, so that people that are having a mental health crisis don't go to jail and aren't put into the legal justice system, but they are diverted. That's what the Diversion First means. Let's divert them before they get to the criminal justice system into mental health. And having sort of been one of the catalysts behind getting that started, I'm really proud that there's over 1,000 people now. In fact, we were talking about earlier, real people where the police showed up because somebody called because they were afraid for their safety, but instead of going to the sheriff's office and being arrested and processed into the criminal justice system, they've gone to a emergency drop-off center in Maryfield, staffed with CSB employees. In some cases, they needed to get emergency detention orders, but they've been civilly committed and moved into the treatment phase. And so, just being able to have access to do that and work on that project has been a really proud achievement. It's something that's tangible that I can look back at. And the beautiful thing about it is really quantifiable, because every time the new annual report comes out, I zip right to that number. How many people have been diverted? How many people didn't go to jail because we've invested in this program?
That's incredible. That's incredible. Well, I know we're going to continue to talk about what's to come when you all go down to Richmond, but Democrats have the majority. Let's talk a little post-election, if you will. What does that mean? How did things change after the election? And how does that really set Democrats up to set the agenda come 2020?
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about election night. I think election night probably went as perfectly as we could have hoped for, right? And there are a lot of people that get a lot more credit. Certainly, probably everybody gets more credit than that than me. But Rip Sullivan, who was our campaigns chair, Eileen Fillercorn, who was our majority leader, Charnel Herring, who was our caucus chair. I mean, you couldn't have asked for more from them. We protected we picked up 15 new seats in 2017. I think most people thought we wouldn't be able to protect all of those seats, that we'd lose a few. Hopefully we could make up enough to stay ahead of the game and maybe take the majority. We protected every one of our 15 new freshmen in these swing districts, and we picked up 5 more seats to get to 55. 6 more seats, right? We were 49. Yeah, we picked up 6 seats. So, to get to 55, protecting all of our incumbents was just a great achievement. And I really think gives us a mandate and tells us that we were pushing the right buttons with Virginians and with the voters. Our message was right on. We were helped some by the redistricting that happened, where a court ordered the unpacking of a lot of minorities out of some of the districts they'd been packed into by Republicans in 2011. But we also picked up places where the Senate didn't pick up seats. So I mean, a lot of it had to do with, I think, what our House caucus was able to achieve. So since then, it's been incredibly busy. 4 days later, we had to go to Richmond and elect a new leadership team. I was very pleased to have helped elect Eileen Fillercorn to be our first female Speaker of the House.
That's great.
400 years of Virginia history.
That is fantastic. About time, right?
Yeah, right. And Charnel Herring was promoted, so she's going to be the majority leader. So we've got, and since then, the transition process has begun, and it's been 20 years that Democrats have been out of power in the Virginia House of Delegates.
Wow.
So one of the things that Delegate Fillercorn decided to do is almost an executive-style transition team. And so she's got a big transition team together. She's already named some of the key replacement positions. So we're going to have Suzette Denslow, who people that are familiar with Virginia politics know, is going to be our new clerk. So we're going to have the first female clerk in 400 years.
That's great.
And she's named a chief of staff, and we've started naming committee chairs. And there's a lot to do. I mean, we knew we wanted to be in the majority, but it's amazing how many little tasks there are. So we've got, I just learned the other day at our committee chair training, there are 51 subcommittees in the House of Delegates, all of which need to have chairs, right? And they all need to be trained up on how to run a meeting and move legislation through. So she had 14 chairs to fill, 51 subcommittee chairs still to fill. She had 14 vice chairs that she had to appoint. So we've got those, the first 28, right? The 14 chairs and vice chairs have all been named.
That's great.
So that's been, and then working on rules for next year. And that's one of the things where I'm the caucus parliamentarian by default. And so I've been working with the transition team with some of our former leaders like Dickie Cranwell and Ward Armstrong on making sure we come up with the rules and procedures we're going to want to live by for the next 2 years at least.
Right.
And then hopefully for a lasting majority.
That's great. So do you know yet what committee you will be on when you go to Richmond?
Well, I hope to get 3 or 4.
Okay.
It depends on my asks. But so far, I know that I'm going to be on the Privileges and Elections Committee. I'm actually going to be the vice chair of that committee, which I'm really excited about because that's going to be a busy committee for these next 2 years as we do redistricting, because redistricting comes through obviously privileges and elections.
Right.
Actually, all constitutional amendments come through privileges and elections. And so we'll also have probably constitutional amendments next session on a right to vote, restoring felons' civil rights. There's a lot of deferred things that we've been wanting to do that'll come through that committee. And then just generally improving the voting process in Virginia.
Right.
One of the playbooks.
Go ahead.
One of the first things that Republicans always do is make it harder to vote.
Yes.
One of the first things we need to do is make it easier to vote.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, please stay with us. We are going to continue to talk to Delegate Marcus Simon as he gives us an update on what's to come when they return to Richmond in January 2020. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Nice going, Spencer. I can't believe we broke Old Man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We? Go to the door, ask for the ball back.
Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtleback.
You're so dead. I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go. See you, dude. See ya. You remember me and you're well.
Nice one. Some friends you are.
Keep smiling, keep shining.
Hi. Hi. Tell him it was an accident. And we can fix the window. Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. One of some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rooftop life. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and we're continuing our conversation this evening with Delegate Marcus Simon. Marcus, thank you again for being with us and taking the time to talk to us about what's to come in January. And I know we're going to start off by talking about the issues this segment. You wrote a beautiful column on your website that you hope to be able to publish this time next year. And what I was so struck by how you went through each of the issues that were your priorities. And number one, you talked about gun violence prevention. What do you hope to get done when you go to Richmond on this issue?
Well, that's one that's obviously gotten a lot of publicity and a lot of traction in the press. But it's an issue that we ran on. I talked a little earlier in the last segment about our victory, our resounding victory on the ballot box was a mandate to do things, and we didn't make. The governor called us down for a special session after the Virginia Beach shooting this summer, and we made. We got about 90 minutes to talk about what we wanted to do, and then Republicans shut the session down. So we're not coming back till after the election. So we ran on that. We didn't hide from it. There have been, I guess, eras in Virginia history where Democrats felt like we didn't want to be too far out front about that or sort of soft pedal our Northern Virginia values for the rest of Virginia. But we've been saying exactly what we're going to do, and we want to. Virginians are tired of dropping off their kids at school and having to worry about whether they're going to be there when they show up at pickup line in the afternoon and what might happen in between. We're really frustrated having to calm our kids' nerves when they come home from having to do lockdown drills at schools. The drill itself is traumatizing.
It is.
Right?
And these are small children. I mean, kindergarten through 5th and 6th grade alone. I mean, they're babies, right?
Right, exactly. And so, I think Virginians have said there's enough's enough. And so there's some really common sense things that we're going to do to make Virginia safer. And we know that other states do these and that they work. Things like universal background checks, right? No one should be able to purchase a firearm without having to go through a basic background check to make sure that they're safe, that they haven't committed a felony, that are not violent, they don't have a violent history, they haven't committed acts of domestic violence. Everybody agrees that folks like that shouldn't be armed, and we should do what we can to prevent them from acquiring firearms. We're going to ban assault rifles in Virginia. Now, we're not going to go around, we're not going to make everybody a felon overnight. And we're not going to have squads of National Guardsmen going door to door to collect people's guns, but we're going to stop selling them. We're going to stop manufacturing them here in Virginia. We're going to make sure that if you are a gun owner, you store your firearms safely, out of the reach of children. We're going to put in place these laws that allow us to get emergency protective orders. So if somebody in your household you're worried is suicidal or is a danger to themselves or others, the police can go in and execute a protective order and take the guns away temporarily until the crisis has passed. And we know these things work. We know they're effective. And those will be things that will pass the first week of session.
That's exciting.
We've got the votes to do it. I mean, if we're up to me, we do them the first day.
Right.
And let's, there's going to be a lot of screaming and shouting and stomping of feet and gnashing of teeth, and let's get that out of our system soon, because there's also a lot of other really important things that need to be done. But nothing I think is more important than the safety of our children, our families here in Virginia, and the fact that guns are so easy to purchase and carry, that people can get concealed carry permits without having to do anything more than take a 15-minute internet video training course. That doesn't make us more safe, that makes us less safe. And so we need to make sure our primary focus is on making Virginians safer.
And a lot of the measures that you just outlined, I mean, are measures that the New York Times recently said 98% of Americans are in favor of, right? I mean,
85% of like NRA members, right?
Right.
I mean, these are really common sense. You lose some of them on the assault weapons ban because they want to get into play semantic games with you about what are you going to call it? What, what does that have to do? Do we even know what we're talking about when we say that? Some of us with military experience do, but be that as it may, making sure that responsible gun owners are accountable for being responsible, making sure we keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of dangerous people is the key. And then also we're going to give localities some local control over that. And that's one of the real frustrations I know in our area. We can't control the location of gun stores in our own local communities. We can't decide that we want our city council meetings or our county board of supervisors meetings to be gun free. We don't, we don't have control over our libraries and our community centers. So I think we're going to give all that control back to localities to say, you know what, we can decide who can bring what into our our locally owned buildings. And so we'll see some real progress on that. And again, right away, that's something I think there's very little interest in compromising on.
Right.
I think these are not new issues and these are not new suggestions. They've been vetted, they've been argued. We know the arguments on both sides, and I think we're ready to move forward with those.
Oh, that's exciting. I know so many Virginians are ready to see state move forward in those issues. So that's incredibly exciting. And one of the other priorities I know that you laid out was voter registration and voter participation. Talk a little bit more about that and what you'd like to see get done in that regard.
Sure, yeah, I started to talk about that before the music
We
started
did,
playing on the
yes.
last segment. But again, one of the first things that Republicans do when they take over a legislature, we've seen this unfortunately, over the last 10, 12 years, one of the first things they do is they start putting up barriers to voting and voter participation. They've taken advantage of Supreme Court rulings that have weakened the Voting Rights Act to look for ways to keep people from voting. We just had a court case that said Wisconsin can continue to purge their voter rolls if people don't respond to a piece of junk mail, right? They get some junk mail in the mail. If they don't respond to it fast enough, they get purged from the voter rolls. The good news is, as Democrats, good thing for us to do politically is also the right thing and the good thing to do, which is once we take over, we need to make voting as easy as possible. We want to expand it. We want everybody to have an opportunity to participate. And so you'll see, first thing you'll see is early voting, right? Because not everybody has the opportunity to take some time off on Tuesdays to go out and vote.
Right.
If you're traveling, we've sort of gone through this charade where you have to choose from a list of 17 or 19 excuses to check a box.
Sure.
We're going to get rid of that. So anybody who wants to vote early
great.
can do that. That's House Bill 1 actually this year. We're also going to look at, I have a bill in for same-day voting. So same-day voting and registration. So you can register and vote the day on election day. Because for whatever it's worth, I mean, people don't always plan things 30 and 60 days out. And as much as engaged as you and I and probably some of our listeners are, some people don't really start paying attention until with a few weeks out.
Right.
And then they find out that they've already missed the window
deadline.
to register, or maybe they have moved, and or maybe they did get purged because it's been too long since they voted. But when they show up on election day at the ballot box, if they're eligible to vote, they ought to be able to cast a vote. We have the technology to do that reliably and safely without compromising the integrity of the election. So why not do it? And I think we're also going to start looking at ways to do automatic voter registration. So where once you register for any state service that indicates you've moved here, so whether you're getting a driver's license, whether you're applying for any kind of government services, and you have to give your resident address, all those forms will default say, do you want this to act as your voter registration? And unless you say, no, I don't want it to, you'll be registered to vote.
So it's more of an opt-out system.
An opt-out system,
That's
exactly.
fantastic.
So we're going to, we'll begin to do that. And then, there are other things we can start to do to make voting easier for everybody. But starting off, the big things are going to be no excuse early voting, same-day registration, and automatic registration. Those are sort of the big three to make voting easier and encourage people to do it.
That's great. So when a young person turns 18, they will automatically then be registered versus having to file additional paperwork for registration.
That's right. So when they get to their driver's license, even if they got it when they were 16,
right?
It'll say when you turn 18, you'll be registered to vote unless you say I'm not eligible.
That's great.
I don't want to be.
That's great. Well, I think doing everything we can to encourage participation at every level is so important. So that's an incredible priority to have.
One of the first bills I put in, tilting at windmills here, was actually to move, and these are long, so there's short-term goals that we have to do and some long-term things. One of the first bills I put in was to move our elections off the odd years and back to the even year cycle so that we'd be coinciding with congressional and presidential elections. I mean, one of the reasons we have odd year elections, one of the reasons we've maintained odd year elections is in fact to suppress the vote, right? So that only the right kind of people who are really engaged, but really the right kind of people are participating in our state elections.
Well, and it gets exhausting every year having elections here in Virginia too.
And so, like I said, so the things we can do right away, the registration, the no excuse, making voting easier, and then long term, there's some structural things that we probably need to look at to make it easier and make people more likely to participate.
That's great. So those are two good top priorities. And I know another big priority for you is raising the minimum wage. And that was also a huge election in this past, huge issue in this past election cycle. Talk a little bit about what we can expect to see in terms of the minimum wage.
Yeah, it's funny. I put in a bill in 2015 just because it was 2015. I said, we got to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And some people, there'd been a movement there. The unions had sort of been talking about a fight for 15, but most people on the policy side were talking about 10-10. And like, we've been talking about 10-10 for so long. It's already too low. We need to go to $15 an hour. People scoffed at that. Well, 2 years later, you had the two candidates for governor on the Democratic side fighting over who was for $15 an hour first.
Right.
And
it's a good fight to have.
Good fight to have. So, again, it's one of those issues. Nobody should be surprised that we're going to raise the minimum wage, and it's going to go to $15 an hour because we've been saying we were going to do that for 2 years. The only reason we haven't done it sooner was because Republicans were in charge of the House and the Senate.
What has been the traditional pushback from Republicans on raising the minimum wage?
So the concern about the minimum wage is that it will cost us jobs, right? And that there are parts of the state where $15 an hour is just unaffordable. And it causes, there are real concerns that we'll have to address with what we call wage compression. It's funny, to Republicans, that's a problem. To me, it's a bonus, right? Which is that if you have entry-level people making about the same as their middle managers, the thought is that the manager won't be as effective, or they'll demand more money. Since they're managing these people, they have more responsibility, they want even more money.
Sure.
And I think, frankly, that's how the minimum wage ought to work. It'll lift everybody up.
Everybody.
And I think that's what will happen in the marketplace, is it'll drive up wages for everybody. And their worry is that either, so you have the wage compression concern, you have the idea that people will hire fewer people if they have to pay them more. It's interesting, you see places like Walmart voluntarily going to $15 an hour. Amazon has said that all of their employees in Virginia are going to make at least $15 an hour. I think the corporate world has sort of caught up and said that's not really the case. And the other thing about these, I'm a small business owner, and you don't really choose the number of employees you have by what they cost you. You do it based on how much work you have for them, right? And you don't say, wow, people are, these employees are really inexpensive. I'm just going to hire a couple extra, sit around and not have enough work to do because it's so cheap. That's not how it works. You hire as many people as you need, and you pay them what you have to, and then some of those costs will get passed on. That's the other concern, is that the costs get passed on to consumers.
Sure.
And so it'll raise the cost of things. But again, I think that right now at $15 an hour, you got to think about what that number really means. Let's look at the number $7.25, the current minimum wage. That's about $14,500 a year, full time. At $15 an hour, we're talking a little over $30,000 a year. We're not talking about paying exorbitant wages to anybody. And frankly, it's not enough for a person living, certainly nobody with a child, to try and raise a family on working full time. So we're not even really to a living wage. So I think there's a recognition that $15 is the right number. We got to get there. We got to give some time to get there. But again, first step is setting the marker. We'll argue a little bit about how many years we take to get there, but that is the number that we'll end up on.
That's fantastic. So we've been able to talk about 3 really important issues in this segment that will really set the tone for session when you return in January. Please stay with us, because we're going to continue this conversation with Delegate Marcus Simon. We'll be right back.
This is the story of a boy who is very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where nothing could get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. It made him feel uncomfortable. One day, he found out he had something called autism. His family got him help, and slowly, he learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies.
Selfie, nailed it. We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Being a dad is an adventure full of special moments.
A cruise!
Surprise! Unexpected moments.
I got this.
And even awkward moments.
Okay, Dad, thank you.
But every moment you spend with your kids, even the smallest moments, can make the biggest impact on your child's life. So take a moment to be a dad today.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. but it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover. And tonight we're having a discussion about the important issues with Delegate Marcus Simon. In our last segment, Marcus, we talked about gun violence prevention, raising the minimum wage. We also talked about making it a lot easier for Virginians to vote. Let's continue on that issue conversation. What other issues and priorities are you going to take back with you when you go to Richmond in January?
So one of the first things we're going to do is back to day one for a second.
Yes.
We have the votes to either do it on day one or whatever day we pick. Is we're going to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in Virginia, and Virginia will be the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So it should be, the lawyers are going to fight about this, but it should be the last state we need to ratify and make the Equal Rights Amendment part of the U.S. Constitution.
That is fantastic. And to do it with having the first woman speaker in over 400 years, it's just an historic time.
Yeah, the only reason we might not do it the first day is just so we can pace ourselves.
Sure.
We have a lot of
you have a lot of priorities, right?
A lot of history to make here.
Yes.
And so you don't want to have one thing steal the thunder from the other. So, and there are some important anniversaries coming up in January. So I think that on one of those sort of meaningful days, and that's the nice thing about having the votes to do this. And with a resolution, that doesn't need to go to committee and be debated a whole lot. So we can sort of set the agenda. That's actually one of the busy things about being in the majority. Not only do we get to, it's also a have to, right? And so, but we'll figure out a day that we want to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. It's going to happen in Virginia. We'll be the 38th state to do it.
Well, let me ask you a little bit on that. I have two little girls that I know you've met tonight, and trying to explain why something like the Equal Rights Amendment hasn't been passed is a difficult conversation for a mother to have with two daughters, right? Talk a little bit about what has been the opposition to passing the ERA in the past.
So there is, and this is sort of sometimes it's the difference between Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia for my kids is sort of how I explain it. But we have people that have a very sincerely held belief that God created women and men to be different, and this isn't just sort of the natural way we evolve for reproductive purposes, but that God wanted us to be different and wanted men to be larger and stronger and be in charge. We've had delegates, just come out and say it just about as plainly as that. That God's plan was for men to be in charge of things, and so why would we give women equal rights? Not everybody's quite that forward about it or that obvious. The other big issue is that it's about abortion and about women's health access. And the big concern is that equal rights that would prohibit, and this has happened in some states, state courts have found that their equal rights amendments to their state constitutions said that you couldn't have a ban on abortion because it would affect women differently than men. And so a lot of the opposition to this is they think this is a sort of a backdoor way of preventing them from repealing Roe versus Wade by putting it into the Constitution. So that's what the two biggest philosophical arguments are in opposition to it. And then, the third, I'll give you the third. The third one is the one that's sounds the most benign, but it's more insidious, which is that we don't need it because we've done it all legislatively. Right? Let's not mess around with the Constitution because we've given you these rights legislatively. The problem with that argument is that, one, it's not something to be given to you or taken away from you, depending on the whims of the legislature or what we men think is you're entitled to or not. And legislation can be repealed. And we're seeing things slide backwards. Congress has refused to re-up the Violence Against Women Act or made it really difficult to do that. And, we see that people are looking and questioning whether we still need Title IX protections for female athletes and things like that. And so we've seen the great things we can accomplish when we legislatively mandate equal treatment of women, but we also know that those gains aren't permanent, but a constitutional amendment would be. Not quite permanent, but about as close to permanent as you can get.
Well, to be in the law of the land, right? And to be in the living document that governs our country is so important, not just for the rights of women, but also to ensure that those rights and equality expand even beyond women, right? And
Absolutely.
we continue to fight for equality, which brings us to one of our next topics that I know that you're very passionate about, is equality and ending discrimination. And it is such an important issue, and while it's always been important, it seems like the national stage, if you will, has been set. In many ways, it has emboldened continued discrimination. Can you talk about what we can do on the state level to combat some of that and to really ensure that people have equal rights here in Virginia?
Sure. So there's a couple of things that we're doing, a couple different tracks. Like a lot of these topics, we do a whole show talking about some of these things.
Right, I know, we could.
Let me start for a second, though, with LGBT equality, right? And making sure we extend these civil rights protections to people so they aren't discriminated against based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity.
Right.
House Bill 3 is to expand our state fair housing statute to include protections for members of the LGBT community. And make that discrimination on that basis a prohibited practice. So it's a bill I've carried for years and years and years. I'm going to be a co-patron of it this year, and this year it's going to pass.
Great.
I've got a bill in this year to also, one of these sort of pernicious problems we've had is one of the last groups of people that I think people feel comfortable discriminating against are members of our trans community and people that are not gender conforming.
Right.
And particularly kids and what they do in schools. And so we're going to have the State Board of Education put together a model policy for how to deal with transgender students in schools. That's going to be a very affirming policy and make sure that they're free from bullying and intimidation, and that teachers and staff get trained on what the science says is the best way to affirm these children so they can have a positive educational learning environment. And to have a model policy and then require that every school system in Virginia adopt that policy or one that's even better.
Wow, that's incredible. So it will be somewhat of a uniform policy for all school districts in Virginia and mandatory training for teachers, principals, educators to ensure.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard from families with trans students is that it gets really difficult for them because they'll be in one school and they will have to educate, frankly, the educators and the principals and the support staff about what it means to be trans, teach them about their kid, what kind of accommodations they need, what they don't need to do. They'll work their way to the system so that things are working really well, and then a new administration comes in. Or you go from that school to middle school and you have to start the process all over again. Or you get a principal that leaves and another principal that you have to start all over. And, and everybody knows, and we know as parents of kids, that you're your own child's best advocate. But there should be a baseline from which everybody gets to start. And so it's important that we do that. Also, I guess it's worth just mentioning as far as equality goes generally, we have a governor who's still recovering from a blackface scandal, right? I mean, there's no use denying that.
No.
But he's committed himself. It's interesting, there was more than words and saying he's sorry or saying he's not, not a bigot, essentially. He's showing it, right, with acts and with actions, and he's letting his actions speak. And so he's had a commission, we're going to look through the code now, and he proposed a bill through a group that he put together to eliminate a series of historically racist laws and statutes. We sort of started this process last year. The minimum wage, even Virginia's minimum wage, had exceptions for certain occupations like shoeshine boys and hotel bellmen and jobs that were traditionally held by African Americans in Virginia. That they, there's people that rely on tips. It's not really the people that rely on tips. These were jobs that you set aside for people of color. So they found about 30 or 40 statutes that are clearly have no real other purpose other than to treat people of African American descent differently. And those bills are all coming off, those laws are all coming off the books. So we'll be doing some of that. One of the things we're looking at too is how to deal with, and we have this, it's funny, as a real estate attorney, here in Northern Virginia, we still have racial covenants on the books in our land records, although they can't be enforced, but we have neighborhoods in Arlington and Fairfax and Falls Church where under the land records, you shouldn't be allowed to, if you're not Caucasian, you shouldn't be allowed to live in those neighborhoods.
Wow.
So we're going to go through and see if we can't figure out how to clean up the land records so that even though it's not enforceable, people understand that those are covenants that shouldn't have been there and that won't be enforced in the future.
And I bet a lot of people don't even know those are still on the books.
Right. No, it's exactly right. But again, it's easy for you and me. Oh, it's kind of a quirky thing about my house. But for somebody who's African American to see that in the deed and the chain of title to their property, it can be a real problem for them.
Awful.
So we shouldn't have to do that. So there's a lot of issues like that, and issues of race and equality, and things that we've just sort of not made a priority in the past, that the governor's definitely making a priority this session. And he's got a legislature that shares his values in doing that. So we'll be doing a lot of that as well.
That's good. And I know too, on your website, you talk beautifully about criminal justice reform. And we saw that in the last election cycle, especially here in Fairfax County with Commonwealth's attorney race, so many races in this area that criminal justice reform was a big issue. Talk about what we can do at the state level to start making those reforms.
Sure. So it's interesting. We had progressive prosecutors who said, look, we're about doing justice. It's not about getting convictions. It's not about racking up wins and losses, but about making sure that we are doing the right thing by folks that find themselves in the criminal justice system. And one of the critiques of that was, you guys can't just choose which laws to enforce and which ones not to. And these policy decisions, you shouldn't be making them. They should be made at the legislative level. Regardless of what you think of that, I think it's worthwhile to try and improve the policy decisions we make in Richmond, to make the jobs of those prosecutors easier. Clearly, the community told us that's where their values are. And so I do think that Commonwealth attorneys have the discretion on how they enforce the law, but I think we ought to make the laws match those values as well. So one of the things we're looking at is legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. We find that that's a crime that on its face sounds neutral, but as in practice is a law that's enforced disproportionately against African Americans in Virginia. And so if that's the case, if it's not evenly enforced, why would we have a law like that on the books? And so let's take that out. Also, giving people a road back into society. It's almost impossible to expunge convictions in Virginia. Really, the only way you get an expunsion is if it turns out you weren't guilty after all, and you can prove you're actually innocent. But sometimes, in order to really be able to get back on your feet, if you made a youthful mistake, if you were drinking at age 20 and you're arrested for underage drinking as a 20-year-old, you're an adult, right? And so it's an adult criminal conviction that never goes away. And so folks around here have to apply for security clearances and sensitive jobs and things like that. Wouldn't it be great if we could expunge those, that 20-year-old who was drinking with his 21-year-old friends and probably shouldn't have been? And if we're going to decriminalize marijuana, we should go back and look at expunging those arrest records as well, so that those things don't follow folks around and become sort of a brand, right? The 21st century, now the data, everything's so data heavy and everybody has access to all of our records. It doesn't become like a 21st century equivalent of a brand on your forehead that says, felon. And we're also going to look at trying to balance things between public defenders and prosecutors. For years under Republicans, the Virginia Association of Commonwealth's Attorneys, our prosecutors lobby, has been very influential, and they've done things to shift the rules, to tilt things in their favor. For instance, you can't have access to your own file, your own police report if you're a defendant, unless the Commonwealth's Attorney agrees to let you see it. So we're going to move to something called open file discovery, so that there's a level playing field between prosecutors and defendants in Virginia.
So important. And I think, as you mentioned, setting the tone really is what we need to do at the state level so that local officials can follow suit. Please stay with us. More to come. We'll be right back.
So, I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things.
2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks.
Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school.
Anywho, how was your day?
Today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
I know.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover. And we're continuing our conversation this evening with Delegate Marcus Simon, who represents the 53rd District, but who represents so many of us here in Northern Virginia and Virginia, because your work definitely extends beyond your district. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to kick off this segment with a question we have from Brian in Fairfax. Can the Virginia legislature do anything about the ICE facilities here in Virginia?
So, Brian, that's a great question. It depends what you mean by anything, right? To the extent that the facilities are here in Virginia, they're here, and we can't kick them out. They're the federal government.
Sure.
So we can't.
Right.
We had a little kerfuffle about that, 130 years ago or so.
We did.
So they're allowed to be here, but it raises an interesting point as to how much do we cooperate with ICE, and there's been a lot of talk about whether under the old party system about trying to ban sanctuary cities in Virginia. When they were talking about immigration, they wanted to ban sanctuary cities. Now they want to create these Second Amendment sanctuaries and localities.
Right.
Let me tell you a little bit about the difference there, Brian. ICE is a federal agency, and they are charged with enforcing federal immigration laws. And that's not necessarily under the criminal code. It's a civil statute they're trying to enforce. And what they wanted to do is to enlist the help of our local sheriffs who are really there to do criminal law and address the public safety of our localities and helping them enforce federal immigration statutes.
Right.
And to the extent that sheriffs say, look, I'm busy enough doing my primary job, and I'm concerned that, frankly, if I start blending the two things and start working to help you with immigration enforcement, it's actually going to make my job of keeping my community safe harder by breaching the trust that I have with certain communities within my locality. That I think it's certainly appropriate for sheriffs and local law enforcement to say, no, you do your immigration thing over here, we're doing our law enforcement thing over here, and we're not going to work together because we're at different purposes. Versus what I think a lot of these localities are essentially saying with these, by the way, the Attorney General recently came out with an opinion that says these Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions are worthless, they're not enforceable. Because what they're trying to do is saying we won't enforce state laws. As state officials, we won't enforce state laws. And it's not nearly the same thing. It's not right. They don't get to determine which laws, by the way, these have all been tested in court. All the things we talked about in the first or second segment, they're all constitutional. They're all reasonable restrictions on gun ownership that the Supreme Court has ruled you can do. And it's not up to a local sheriff to decide the General Assembly that pays his salary, by the way, through the compensation board, has gone too far. So I'm not too worried about the sanctuary cities that are popping up, these Second Amendment sanctuaries, other than a sort of form of protest. And I'll take them as that. And I hear you all saying that we don't overreach, but beyond that, I don't think they have much value.
Well, it's interesting. I just recently met with a group of high school students, and we were talking about the presidential election coming up in 2020, and the top two issues and they were telling me for high school students in our area here in Northern Virginia is gun violence prevention, which we all knew, and two is immigration, because it has touched the lives of so many of their classmates or them themselves. And so it was really interesting to hear that those two issues are the two issues they're going to be voting on when they go to the polls.
Yeah, and we're going to have, by the way, we're going to have a state DREAM Act, right, that says that, hey, that even though DACA may be ending, that people that were previously eligible for in-state tuition under DACA will continue to be allowed to do that. And we're going to figure out the right words to say that anybody who would have been eligible for this benefit prior to January 1st of 2018 or whatever, will continue to be eligible in Virginia. So there are things we can do at the state level to continue to make people feel welcome, to make, frankly, a lot of the kids that you and I and people younger than us certainly grew up with, feel like full-fledged members of our community because they are.
Right. And we talked a little bit in the last segment how you can really set the tone, if you will, for the entire state down in Richmond and the work that you do. And we've seen time and time again since 2016, Virginia set the tone in so many different ways, whether it's in election, whether it's in activism, whatever the case may be. So I think it's exciting. We've only been able to talk about just a few issues tonight. But one of the issues, too, I want to bring up before we talk more about January, when you go back to Richmond, is climate change. I know that's something you're very passionate about, and also so many people are very passionate about that particular issue across the state and across the country right now. What can you see happening in January?
So two things I want to react to. One is that it's interesting. I mean, people really are watching what happens in Virginia. I mean, there was a Wall Street Journal article today about, everybody's, the Democrats got their wish. Now let's see what they do with it, right? And particularly, I think, as it pertains to the environment and the climate crisis. And there's some tension among Democrats, but I think just generally that will we overreach? Will we try and go too far too fast? And I think the climate issue is one of the areas where there are two different schools of thought. And we have two different bills that have been introduced already. One's sort of calls it a Virginia Green New Deal, which has very aggressive timelines for just completely stopping the use of fossil fuels. We also have a bill that's been out there that's a more gradual approach to diversifying our use of renewable energy without completely getting rid of fossil fuels, and it's not quite as aggressive a timeline. Both of these things, by the way, are infinitely better than what the Republicans have wanted. When they've continued to give tax credits to extract coal from the ground in Southwest Virginia and burn coal, where they've encouraged offshore drilling and things like that. So either flavor you get from Democrats is going to be just head and shoulders above what we have before. I think there's a real recognition that that the time, though, for half measures is passed, right? We can't sort of incrementally do this and be effective. That Virginia has some very low-lying areas in the Hampton Roads area that are really on the front lines of the climate crisis. That are where places in Norfolk and Hampton Roads, we have to start talking about abandoning them because the persistent recurrent flooding just makes them uninhabitable. So we know that it's a crisis. How quickly we go is the question of whether we're going to go fast or really, really, really fast. But nobody's talking about going slow or even medium on this.
That's great.
One of the things I've been trying to do for years is to just give people freedom to put solar panels on their houses and own the electricity that they produce, right? We have a monopoly in Virginia, Dominion Virginia Power here in our area, and Appalachian Power, where the monopoly says we get to own all the power generation facilities, even the solar panels you put on your roof, right? And so we're going to have to start poking some holes in that and giving people freedom to put solar panels on their roof and then sell that electricity back into the grid to let people earn back some of the costs of putting it in, make it practical. So you don't just see it on McMansions, but you get to see anybody who wants to can afford to put up solar on their house and power their house themselves from the sun and then sell some of the electricity back into the grid.
Oh, so important, so important. And I know we could talk all evening about these issues, and so many we didn't get to cover. But we will see redistricting come up, and we only see that, every 10 years? Is that right? So let's talk quickly about redistricting and what that process could look like and what it could ultimately mean for Virginians.
Sure. So the redistricting is, for years, Democrats have said we want to get politicians out of the business of drawing their own districts. And that people ought to pick their politicians and not the other way around. Now that we have the majority and it's our turn to draw the maps, I don't think anybody's saying we ought to go back to doing it the old way. But last year, before Democrats took over, we passed a constitutional amendment, an amendment to Virginia's constitution, to say that we will take the job of redistricting away from the legislature and put it into this bipartisan commission. And it was the best deal we could get from Republicans who still controlled the legislature at the time. So now the question is, do we want to do nonpartisan redistricting the way that Republicans were willing to do it, or do we want to look for a better way now that we're in charge The problem with trying to find a better way is that the way we amend the Constitution in Virginia is you have to pass the amendment 1 year, have an election, and then the exact same amendment, word for word, has to pass again in the following General Assembly. So if we don't just pass the constitutional amendment the way it is, then we could redistrict however we Democrats decide to do it, and we can do a nonpartisan commission. But then we don't have any guarantee that that's going to be the way we do it going forward without, because the Constitution hasn't changed. Sort of like what we were talking about with the ERA. So the other question, the other approach to that would be that we come up with what's called enabling legislation, right? So the Constitution is sort of a foundational document, and it lays out the framework, but we have to fill in the details, right? It's sort of a scaffolding, right? And we fill in the details that make the building through enabling legislation and criteria legislation, other bills that we pass to essentially tell the commission how they're going to make their decisions, right? So the commission says, you will be the folks, that's the who will draw the districts, but we can tell them with legislation how to draw the districts. So some people think if we have strong enough criteria and strong enough enabling legislation to tell this commission, which we may not love the makeup of the commission and how it gets chosen, but if we give them strong enough criteria for how they have to draw the districts, then maybe it doesn't matter as much who's drawing them, and we could support the constitutional amendment. So there's going to be a conversation still to be had. I think at the end of the day, well, I can tell you this. We will not have politicians drawing their own districts in a back room, trying to figure out how to draw, myself in and my enemy out of the district. That's the old way of doing it. It won't be that. It may not be the exact same makeup of the commission that was in the constitutional amendment. It may be we come up with a better way, and then we work on amending the Constitution before 2031 comes around. Or it may be that we pass the amendment with really strong supporting legislation.
But it won't be done in a dark, smoke-filled room, right?
You have my word. And again, as vice chair of P&E, as much power as vice chair, it doesn't sound that powerful. As much as I have something to say about it, I'm going to push to make sure we have fair redistricting. At the end of the day, we owe it to the voters. They voted. We've run on this issue for years.
Absolutely.
And if we do anything other than a really clean, clear, nonpartisan, non-political redistricting process, we'd be turning our backs on the voters. They wouldn't forgive us.
That's right. That's right. Well, real quickly, I know our show is coming to an end, but how can constituents of yours and just people here in Virginia get involved in the legislative process when you all go to Richmond in January?
Sure. Well, one of the things you can do is follow me on Twitter and Facebook.
No, please do.
That helps. I mean, Marcus Simon at on Twitter, and I'm always posting links to bill summaries and bills and things that are going on, newspaper articles that are relevant. You can look up Delegate Marcus Simon on Facebook and find my Facebook page. I have a website, marcussimon.com, but mostly that's just links back to Facebook and Twitter because a lot of this stuff's happening in real time on social media. Stay informed. Follow your legislator. If I'm not your delegate, figure out who your delegate is. I guarantee they have a Twitter page and a Facebook page. They sign up for their email updates. And then when they send out news, let them know what you're thinking. Let them know how that makes you feel. And tell your neighbors and your friends. It's interesting. Many of us have spent the last 3 years kind of raging against what's happening in Washington.
Right.
And to some degree, I mean, I made my reputation in Richmond being the troublemaker, but now it's time to sort of lift our majority up and give them the support and tell them that you're with them, and we expect them to do what they said they do and give them the help they need to do it.
That's great. Well, thank you for having the opportunity to come on tonight. Thank you for your service for all of us here in Virginia.
This was great.
Thank you, and we look forward to having you back. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a happy holiday.
Boom, right into the second.